Hi, so this is a video that we've made to help give you some tips about doing well in your exams. And it's especially focused around those exams that you'll get a lot in sociology and social policy modules, where you're asked to answer essay questions but under exam conditions. So first of all, we're going to start by explaining sorts of things that you ought to be doing in the exam before you even put pen to paper and before you start answering any of the questions. So first of all, it's really important to begin by carefully reading through all the questions. Now, the course Introduction to Social Research is actually a seen exam, so you'll have already seen some of the questions in advance, but it's still important that you make sure you identify which questions you want to answer and that you take that time at the start just to calm your nerves, read through the questions and check that you know what you're doing. So it's good practice to read every question on the exam paper twice. And the second time you read it, you want to underline some of the key words and make some key notes about what the question is asking you. So I've got an example here. Okay, so here's an example of the sort of question that you might get asked in an exam. And here the question asks you to evaluate the use of quantitative methods in social science research, illustrating your answer with empirical examples. So here I want to go through the question and highlight some of the most important words. So first of all, it's asking me to evaluate, and then it's asking me about quantitative methods. So I'll highlight that as well. Whoops. And then it's also asking me to illustrate my answer with something further. So highlight illustrating, and then with empirical examples. So I'll highlight that as well. So here I've gone through the question and I've picked out the main points. And then I would probably jot down a few notes to myself just to remind myself of what that question wants me to do. So it's a question about quantitative methods. It needs some empirical examples and they want me to evaluate those methods. So they want me to think about kind of the advantages and disadvantages of those sorts of methods. Once you've done this with every question, you can then make an informed decision about which are going to be the best questions for you to answer in the exam, which ones you've revised the most, and then I can choose my questions. So once I've chosen my questions, I then need to work out my timings for the exam to make sure that I've got enough time to answer everything properly. So let's imagine that we're doing an exam that lasts between 2 and 4 p.m. and that we've got to answer 2 essay questions in that time. And I might have already taken 5 minutes reading those essay questions and deciding which ones to choose. So then I'd start to try and jot down a timetable for myself. So I might start by saying kind of 2:05 to 2:15, 10 minutes planning my answers. And then I might think, right, well, 2:15 to 3 o'clock, I'm going to answer essay 1. And I'd write all this on the top of my exam paper. And then, okay, 3 o'clock to 3:45, essay 2. And then once I've written my essays, I want to make sure I've got time to check them through. So then I'd probably write down 3:45 to 4, check answers. And I'd write that at the top of my exam paper so I could be sure that I was on target. And if, for example, I spent way too long on essay 1 and it was already 3:05, I'd know that for sure and I'd have to stop what I was doing and move on to essay 2 to make sure I have enough time. So I would urge you to do this at the top of your exam paper before you even start answering the questions. Okay, so once you've decided which questions you're going to answer and you've planned your time so you know how long you've got to spend answering each question, the next thing that you need to do is plan your answers. Now this is really important because it can be tempting when you're under exam conditions to start writing straight away and to kind of get rushed and panicked and think that you need to write down everything that you know about the topic as quickly as possible. But this is a mistake, because even though you're against the clock, it's important to apply the same principles to doing an exam essay as you would a normal essay. So it needs to be properly structured and planned. So your plan should include an introduction, a conclusion, and 4 or 5 key points that you want to discuss in answering the question. It can also be a good idea to include in your plan any references that you want to make or examples that you want to use in backing up your argument. Now, some people find it really useful to jot down a plan for all their questions at the start. So if you're doing an exam that asks you to answer 2 questions, they would plan both those questions at the beginning of the exam. And it's entirely up to you which way you do it. But I think that writing the plan for both questions at the start sometimes gives people confidence. It makes them worry less about going blank or panicking halfway through. And it also gives them a bit of reassurance that they know what's coming up and they know what they're going to write for all their questions. But as I say, it's up to you how you do that, as long as you allocate plenty of time to properly planning your answers before you start writing. Okay, so when you're planning your answer to your essay, you need to think carefully about the terms that are used in the question and specifically what sort of response they're asking for. So I'll give you a few examples to just sort of get you thinking. For example, you might be asked to compare something to something else in an exam question. And here, the question is asking you to outline both phenomena and then draw out the similarities and differences between them. You might also want to think about including a brief discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of one phenomena as compared to another. Alternatively, you might be asked to define something. And if so, this question is requiring a concise and clear explanation of a certain phenomena. You might want to think here about the quality of the definition. You might want to think about whether there are any exceptions to the rule or limitations to the definition you're using. You might also want to think about what makes this phenomena or concept different to others. So, for example, if you're asked to define quantitative research, you might want to think about how it's different to qualitative research to help you come up with that definition. You might be asked to discuss something. This is a really common term that you're often asked in exam questions. And if so, this is requiring you to produce an analysis of a certain phenomena or concept, where you'll want to also think about the advantages and limitations of the thing you're being asked to discuss. On a similar note, you might also be asked to evaluate things, and this is extremely common in sociology exams. And in some ways, this term is asking you to go even further. So like in being asked to discuss something, you're being asked for an appraisal, you're being asked to sum up the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages. In an evaluation type question, you might also want to think about what you think, whether you're going to take a stand in your response to the question and conclude by coming down on one side or the other. You don't have to, it's just something to consider. Finally, you might also be asked to illustrate, which might mean backing up or enhancing your argument by using particular examples or illustrations from the literature. Actually, even if you're not specifically asked to illustrate something in your response, it's often worthwhile to think about doing so anyway. It can usually enhance your answer and make it more robust. Okay, so now that you've planned your answer, it's finally time to start writing your exam answer. Now, as I said before, a good answer to an exam essay question is similar to a good essay in general. It needs a good structured argument, and this means beginning with an introduction. So in your introduction, you need to define the question that you're being asked, any of the key terms, and to state how you're going to answer the question, so what your argument is going to be and what you're going to say. Once you've provided your introduction, you can go on and outline the main points of your argument, using your plan to make sure that you don't forget anything important. Now, although you're not allowed to bring books into an exam with you, you should still aim to reference your argument, your answer to the exam question, with literature to support what you're saying. So although you might not always be able to remember exact quotations, the sorts of things that you might use in an essay if you had the book there with you, you can still make reference to some of the key arguments and debates that you've come across in the literature. So, for example, you might want to say something like, as Mason 2002 argues, qualitative researchers often have an epistemological position which views the interpretations and meanings of social actors as useful knowledge. So you might want to make a point like that and make sure that you reference Mason, you might want to reference Bryman or Durkheim or any of the other people that we've come across in the course. Now, some questions might explicitly ask you to illustrate your argument using empirical examples. Now, this means that you're being asked to use examples from actual research projects to back up what you're saying. So again, familiarising yourself with some useful examples that you might want to draw upon in your exam should be part of your revision. And you might want to say something like, survey research usually involves the use of closed questions, which can be quantified by analysers. This can be seen in the British Social Attitudes Survey, which asks people questions about their attitudes and opinions to various social phenomena. So in that example, we've used the British Social Attitudes Survey as an empirical example to illustrate the point we're making about surveys more generally. So it's important when you're revising for your exam to think about some empirical examples and some references from the literature that you might want to draw upon in your answer. Now finally, your answer should finish with a conclusion, and this conclusion should tie together the strands of your argument, and if you're trying to make a point, it should state your stance. So if you've come down on a certain side and said that a certain method is better than another, for example, you need to summarise this point in your conclusion, although you don't always have to take a stance if that's not what the question's asking you to do. It can also be useful in your conclusion to link back to some of the key terms and phrases in the question to demonstrate that you've properly answered it. Now finally, once you've structured your essay, you've got an introduction, your main points with some examples and references, and a conclusion, you need to make sure you leave enough time to properly check it through, check the spellings, check that it's legible and people will be able to read it. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and lots of luck in your exams.